This program is a paid commercial announcement and in no way represents the views of WPHT or its management.
Jake Media Partners presents The Adam Malamut Show. Real people, real perspectives, real opinion. Presented by the law offices of Adam Malamut and Associates. Powered by InjuredWorkers.com and driven by Piazza Premium Automobiles. Now, live from the Malamut and Associate Law Studios, The Adam Malamut Show. Hosted by Adam Malamut.
And welcome in, everybody, here on a Sunday night on Talk Radio 1210 WPHT. This is the Adam Malamut Show. Real people, real perspectives, real opinion.
Krause, it's fantastic to be back here. We've had some phenomenal shows.
We really have. The show's gotten off to a fantastic start.
We're going to go a little different direction today, maintaining that high level. We're going to talk about environmental law. My guest today is one of my partners, 30 years experience, a former deputy attorney general. He's worked on federal and state environmental law, Solid Waste Management Act, pollution and hazardous waste disposal laws. I'd like to introduce my partner, Tony Drollas.
Thank you, Adam.
So, environmental law, people think of climate change, they think of pollution, they think of air pollution, water pollution, and last week there was a lawsuit that caught some attention involving PFAs. What are PFAs?
I think everyone's seeing the letters PFAS, PFOA, PFOS in headlines, and the headlines are scary a lot of times because people are very concerned about these chemicals that are entering everyone's lives. And it seems in some ways as much environmental protection has been in place for the past 40, 50 years that nothing ever changes, that you can have what the situation we're dealing with like is now, that a new chemical is entering the marketplace, everyone's interacting with it, and it affects their lives and it becomes hazardous. And it seems frustrating in a way that people think, well, we've been dealing with these issues for a long, long time now. We should be way ahead of the curve and problems like this shouldn't happen. But it's a reflection of how times change and how things just never change in that sense. Industry works hard to make chemicals that try to make our lives better, that make industry that much more profitable. But a lot of times people don't understand the long-term impacts of interacting with chemicals that seem perfectly harmless and helpful at the time, that over time can have adverse human health impacts. And that's what we're dealing with PFAS, PFOA, PFOS. They're known as, in general, the forever chemicals. They're wonderful substances. If industry has its way all day, they're extremely effective. They're resistant to water. They're resistant to heat. They literally last forever. Once they're out in the environment, they stay there. And the issue for humans is that once you ingest the chemical, it stays with you. And what we're learning over time is that what a chemical that might seem harmless at first, over time, is starting to have adverse human health impacts.
So, Tony, you talked about a lot of different acronyms, and environmental law is one of the areas. And when you and I speak, you probably in 3 or 4 breaths throw about 20 acronyms at me. It's filled with acronyms. So we're going to try to help our listeners better understand these issues and these topics that are reported on in a much more user-friendly way. These PFAs, just like other environmental concerns, they've been around for a long time, right?
They have. They've been manufactured. They're all synthetic chemicals. They're organic acids. They fall under the general heading of PFOA, which the scientific name is perfluorooctanoic acid. And under those headings of organic acids, there are all different subsets, PFAS, the per and polyfluoroalkyl substances is how that's defined. The brand name for PFOA is something that everyone knows and they've known forever. It's essentially Teflon. And it's something that's used in nonstick cookware. It's something that's added to fabric to make it stain resistant. It's something that's been used more recently in firefighting. It's added to firefighting foam, which is resistant to heat. It's extremely effective. The problem is, since it's a forever chemical, it never breaks down. So once the foam, for example, flows away from wherever the fire is being fought, and a lot of times this is in an airport where there's a runway and then there's grassy areas. Underneath those runways, in many cases, are underground aquifers. Those are sources of drinking water. And these forever chemicals will leach through the soil down into the aquifer, and that's where they'll stay. And then they're pumped out, and then once they're ingested by humans, they stay with humans.
And obviously there was a valid reason for the introduction of PFAs, PFAS, and all the other acronyms that we've talked about. But in our daily lives, the companies that manufacture these chemicals, 3M, DuPont, other companies like that, they manufactured this firefighting foam, for example, because they identified that as the fastest way to control a fire, right?
Correct.
And I guess part of the problem is it's been on the market for so long, and over the years it was kind of, no pun intended, we buried our heads in the sand. But now it's becoming a real environmental issue because it was never addressed as to how to, or it was never successfully addressed as to how to dispose of this foam. Is that right?
That's correct. That, essentially the foam essentially just disappeared. It was either washed away by other water or it just disappeared into the soil. So when you're talking about firefighting foam, it's something that really was never cleaned up as some type of a hazardous substance. It was just left to be, assuming it was a harmless chemical. Unfortunately, over time, we're finding out that the more you stay in contact with these forever chemicals and the longer they stay in contact with you, the more harmful they become.
So part of the other issue is we don't know what kind of warnings were given when these products, these firefighting foams and Teflon and other things with these types of toxic chemicals were distributed. We don't know if they really gave the end user, the consumer, what we call as lawyers informed consent, right? Well, whether they gave a ample warning as to health risks, environmental risks, how to dispose of it, what's going to happen down the road.
That's correct. And industry at the time, and more recently even, thought that they were handling a chemical that was perfectly safe and that was beneficial. Unfortunately, over time, we've learned that that's not the case. It's something that it's pervasive. In addition to being long-lasting, one of the harmful impacts of these PFA chemicals, for example, can be from dust in carpeting indoors in your home. When the carpeting breaks down, the PFAs are in the dust in the air, and they can be ingested in that way.
One of the few things I remember about my law school torts class, and whenever I say tort, and I have people that are listening that may not be lawyers, I want to make sure everybody understands we weren't making pastry in law school. But my law school tort class, I had a terrific professor, Mark Rodert, who talked about B is less than P times L. The burden's less than the probability times the risk. And that's to evaluate whether a dangerous condition, how to assess the tort with a dangerous condition. Here, it seems like big business chose the almighty dollar over the probability times the loss, right? Over the probability of there being something down the road and what that cleanup down the road might actually be. And in today's show, we're going to talk about how it affects the public, how it affects natural resources, how it affects health concerns. When we come back in our next segment, I want to get into how pervasive PFAs are. I want to start talking about where this industry, the PFA industry, the chemical industry, is going to go, and then how government and private sector can combat the cleanup costs and remediation.
This is the Adam Malamut Show here on Talk Radio 1210 WPHT. Our guest today, Tony Drollas, who's an attorney, in conversation with Adam Malamut. He joins Jalen Mills, Senator Raymond Lesniak, and Pennsylvania State Rep Jared Solomon as part of the Adam Malamut Show. Back in a moment.
The Adam Malamut Show. Real people, real perspectives, real opinion.
And back here on Talk Radio 1210 WPHT, this is the Adam Malamut Show. Adam?
So, Tony, when we broke, we were talking about big business, no surprise, big business picking profits over people. I mean, could you imagine that? As a plaintiff's lawyer myself, you know, we deal with that all the time. Having an opportunity to look at what their real motivation is, and obviously they're there to make money, and we don't begrudge that, but there's a responsibility, and there's a from public safety, health, welfare, and at the same point, making sure that you're selling what you're telling the public that you're selling, and they have an opportunity to buy what they know that they're buying. This PFAS issue and the chemicals that are being emitted into the environment over years and years without anything being done. How pervasive is this issue?
It's as pervasive as can be. It's something that impacts all of our lives. It impacts sources of drinking water. It impacts the air and the soil. It's one of those chemicals that unfortunately has made its way into our lives in just about every respect. We encounter these chemicals all the time. And when you see something as innocuous and beneficial, you would think as Teflon. And you assume that industry's done everything that it can to regulate it, to study it, to measure its long-term impacts, to ensure the public that it's safe. And as I said earlier, it seems like the more things change, the more things stay the same. We're running into issues now that we seem to have conquered a long time ago, but they keep coming back. And I think it's just a function of how these things can be regulated, how aggressive industry can be, and how creative they can be in coming up with new chemicals. But then the extent to which we really can't know how something can have an adverse impact on us until many years later.
So, hot topic this past week was there was Elcon was trying to do a waste management plant in Bucks County on the other side of the river. It's a hot topic right now because we're concerned with landfills filling up, and maybe you can speak for a second to Superfund sites, because I know that when you were in the Attorney General's office, you had experience with that as well as in private sector. But as these landfills continue to fill up, we don't really know what's in them or what's going to happen afterwards, right?
Well, particularly as it relates to PFAs. You know, landfills were the most ancient form of human beings dealing with their waste. Dig a hole, put it in the ground, cover it up, walk away, hope we never have to deal with it again. We've come a long, long way, particularly in New Jersey, from those bad old days. And construction of new landfills and new hazardous waste disposal facilities in particular is extremely tightly regulated. We do it in a way so that we can control what's emitted into the air and into the soil and into water from these landfill locations. What we're learning now, and it brings it home with PFA, is that if we don't understand the long-term impacts of these chemicals, and that there are things that can't be understood, quite frankly, until they're studied over a period of decades, that landfills, even non-hazardous landfills that are filled with municipal solid waste, the stuff that leaves your curb a couple times a week forever, could be ending up in landfills, and when it comes in contact with rainwater, leaches through the landfill and back out into the atmosphere, and we're going to have to deal with it again.
So we've talked about landfills, and in preparation for this show, we talked a little bit about wastewater treatment plants and their relation to landfills. So do PFAs cycle between landfills and water treatment plants? How does that work?
You know, we call them forever chemicals at the beginning of the show. That's a perfect example of how they can be handled that way. If PFAs enter a landfill, Teflon frying pans, clothing, whatever source of the waste enters the landfill, it's a fact of life that landfills are impacted by rainwater. The rainwater seeps into the landfill. It creates what's known as leachate. Landfills are obligated by law to regulate how their leachate is handled, and in many cases, it has to be treated. It can't just be allowed to fall into whatever sources of water may be underneath the landfill or near them. What those landfill facilities will do, will either treat the waste right there at their own plant and create sludge in the process, which is just a natural part of that whole water treatment system. The sludge frequently is then taken back to landfills and used as cover, or it can be applied to ground, agricultural ground, as fertilizer. But particularly when it goes back to landfills, you're now taking the PFA that's then treated as leachate, disposed of from the treatment facility as sludge, and then reintroduced back into the landfill, so that a forever chemical is now in a forever cycle of never, ever going away, even when we're trying to deal with it as a waste.
So as a taxpayer, that frightens me, because I think, okay, my town that I live in has a landfill, has a treatment center, has waste from every single one of our neighbors. I have no idea who's disposing of whatever items it is in their trash containers that's being picked up by Public Works. How does the municipality manage this? And is this something that I need to worry about in my community?
It's something that everyone needs to worry about in their communities, and it's a burden that municipalities are going to have to face. They're often the ones who control their own solid waste disposal. They're the ones who contract for hauling and disposing of it. They're the ones who'll be responsible, potentially, for contamination issues in landfills down the road. It's something that government and industry are going to have to get ahead of before something enters the waste stream. But in the meantime, and this is the struggle that government's having right now, we're going to have to deal with what is. A lot of what is something that we didn't know about 40 years ago, and it may not be something that we'll fully understand until probably decades from now. So what it is an added cost. It's going to be an added liability and an added cost. Right now, it's an unknown. It could be a very large number.
And in addition to the liability and the cost, we have that unquantifiable, unknown health risk, right?
That's correct. That's correct.
So in addition to the health risk, we've got the costs. How about our natural resources? And let's run through that quick before we take a break. What's it doing to our natural resources?
Well, if you look at natural resources as wildlife, as parks, as rivers and creeks, and all the places that the public can enjoy, it's out there. It's impacting them. It's going to have to be remediated. The cost could be astronomical. It's something that the state of New Jersey, more recently, as a trustee of natural resources, is taking action, litigation, in fact, against manufacturers of these PFAs to try to recover damages to natural resources as a result, as kind of a starting point from the government side, aggressively, to try to deal with the issue.
We're going to get real deep into regulation and standards in our fourth segment. When we come back, I want to start talking about this health issue, because I think that when we think of movies and Aaron Brockovich comes to mind, my biggest concern raising a young family, not that I'm young, but my family is health issues.
One programming reminder for our listeners of the Adam Malamut Show. Watch for details coming up in the next month. We will be live at Chickies and Pete's in Marlton, a special live roundtable conversation. So we'll keep everybody up to date as those details come together. We'll get to a commercial break right here on Talk Radio 1210 WPHT.
From the Malamut and Associates Law Studios, this is the Adam Malamut Show.
Back here on Talk Radio 1210 WPHT. This is the Adam Malamut Show. Real people, real perspectives, real opinion. Adam?
Tony, let's bring it to what I believe is really the most important issue here, which is health. Without our health, we have nothing. And I don't want to take away from the folks who are concerned about our natural resources. I certainly don't want to minimize that concern. But I think that might be 1A, where health is number one. So, primary health concern, what do you think?
The primary health concerns, look, ultimately, where government gets involved and where industry ultimately responds is where chemicals and waste, hazardous substances have adverse human health impacts. That's really what all of our laws are ultimately designed to protect. It's important to protect streams and parks and wildlife and vegetation from a general standpoint. Of course it is. But ultimately, where chemicals, waste present risk to human health, that's the holy grail of environmental regulation. It's a double-edged sword. It's a Rubik's Cube in some respects, because particularly as it relates to PFAS, it's something that's frustrating because the chemicals have been in the stream of commerce for decades, but only now are we beginning to realize that they're contributing to adverse human health impacts. Liver toxicity. They're toxic to kidneys. They can potentially cause cancer, although that's not fully studied yet, understood. And we're also understanding that a developing fetus is particularly sensitive to toxicity from PFOA. And of course, that is going to be the greatest concern by far of regulation under environmental law. So what industry is doing is responding to action by government to study these substances further. The government, Congress in particular, decades ago, and it gets back to how frustrating this is, because again, you'd think this issue would have been studied and understood by now, so these things wouldn't happen, but they do. The Congress, through the Safe Drinking Water Act, has required the Environmental Protection Agency, who is the lead arm, the great protector of the environment on the administration, government side in the executive branch, to develop regulations to implement the broad requirements of, say, the Safe Drinking Water Act. And there are so many environmental laws out there, but let's just focus on the Safe Drinking Water Act in particular. When the Safe Drinking Water Act was amended back in the 90s, EPA was required to come up with an inventory of emerging, really not understood chemicals that scientific research was beginning to show in general might have an adverse impact on humans, but we don't quite know why, or we don't quite know the full extent of. So where you're dealing with sources of public drinking water in particular, the federal government requires all those sources, and this includes municipalities who own their own sources of drinking water, to study and test for chemicals that are currently unregulated. Unregulated meaning there's no limit that's been established as to how much is too much. But in the process of trying to find out how much is too much, in the first instance, you find out where it is. You find out what concentrations and how it's moving around, and then ultimately how it could be impacting humans. At the same time, you're studying, in order to try to develop a regulatory limit, what potentially adverse impacts there could be. As it relates to PFAs in particular and PFOA, in May of 2016, EPA issued a drinking water health advisory, what was known as a lifetime health advisory for PFOA. And drinking water is now tested very heavily to identify where these substances are located and in what concentration, but still the government is in the process of trying to figure out how much is too much. The emotional reaction to these types of issues is exactly what you would think it would be. Eliminated immediately, yesterday. Get rid of all of it. We can't do that, realistically. We don't have all of the time it would take. We don't have all the money that it would take. We don't have all the other resources to make something like that happen. So, and frankly, if the government came along and banned every chemical that was potentially toxic immediately, industry would push back, and in many cases, industry would win, because that's not government's role, is to make emotional reactions and just to ban everything. Government still has an obligation to come up with limits that are fair and are reasonable. So in this instance, the government has been studying for a period of time now just what ought to be a regulatory limit for how much is too much, but they're not there yet.
Now, we talk about regulatory limits, and we'll get more into that in the fourth segment, but that EPA study, or advisory rather, that you mentioned from May of 16, they talked about 70 parts per trillion. What does that mean? When somebody hears parts per trillion, what does that quantify?
Well, it's a reflection of what could be a very toxic substance, and parts per trillion, parts per billion, parts per million are measures of how much the substance can be tolerated in a quantity of water that you ingest over a period of time. Anyone ingests over a period of time. The more toxic the chemical, the lower the limit, parts per billion, parts per trillion, it's measured in order to reduce its presence in drinking water if that's what's needed.
So we're going to jump ahead for a minute. Let's talk about remediation, treatment issues, challenges, concerns. I mean, I imagine that when you start talking about treating a landfill or a wastewater treatment plant, you're getting into enormous money.
Yes, you are.
And these companies that have made billions of dollars putting these chemicals into commerce, where's their role in this?
Their role is, as they're responsible now, where the public is suing them in
trying to make them responsible.
Trying to make them responsible.
Right.
In some cases, they're responding by way of getting adverse judgments against them and responding to that and to stop behavior that led to those types of judgments. Where the public always has the right on their own, but of course they'd have to pay the freight in order to bring industry to the table to come to some type of agreement to compensate people for their costs in treating the adverse impacts of these chemicals, and then at the same time changing their own ways to make sure that they're no longer used, which is always a cost to the industry. That's why they're using it in the first place, because it's beneficial for them. So that's going on now. But at the same time, government is now, and EPA in particular, is being dragged, if some people believe, unwillingly, to establishing regulatory limits to apply to industry to make sure that, number one, the chemicals aren't used anymore. And industry, for the most part, in the United States, voluntarily agreed to stop using these chemicals, introducing new versions of these chemicals into our lives in 2015. Does that mean that there are no longer new chemicals being introduced into products that we buy? No, because the United States is not the only producer of products that we buy. It's a worldwide issue. But at least as far as the U.S. is concerned, there's an agreement to stop doing this in 2015. That's really only the very tip of the iceberg, because what we're concerned with is not just human interaction with chemicals as they're newly introduced into the marketplace and into our lives, but the long-term impacts of Teflon pans and clothing and firefighting foam that's been used for decades that we're still going to have to deal with. It's not just going to go away.
what bothers me, one of the many things that bothers me about this is you and I have talked over, an extended period of time about the opioid litigation and how pharmaceutical companies, big pharma, have created, again, profits over people and helped to perpetuate a problem that has been around for a long time, but nowhere near where it is now. But the opioids, it hits individuals, it hits their families. PFAs hits everybody. It doesn't know addiction. It doesn't know geographical boundaries to the extent that it doesn't pick and choose which communities it's going to be in. It's wherever they've entered. We talked about military bases in preparation for the show. This firefighting foam was used on all the military bases. So how many members of our United States military and armed services, how many of those people have been affected? We don't know.
No, we don't. We have to assume it's a very, very large number. And what's frustrating about an issue like this is where you're dealing with the horror of opioids, and it's a tragedy. But unfortunately, people have become addicted to these substances, and people are trying to put a stop to it. People, the government, individuals. For these types of chemicals, you buy nonstick cookware, you buy clothing that is stain resistant, or you use firefighting foam. And what could be more beneficial than a foam that puts out fires? I mean, if there's not much more than that. It's completely the opposite. It's purchasing, it's ingesting something, carpeting in your home, something that seems completely beneficial, not only not harmful but beneficial, but now it's going to be with you forever.
So we're going to pick this up in the next segment. This is a perfect segue to us talking about regulation, creating standards, and cleanup cost recovery. So when we come back, we'll get into those issues.
Real people, real perspectives, real opinion. Now back to Adam Malamut.
Thanks, everybody, for listening on Talk Radio 1210 WPHT.
Krause, this music's awesome. I mean, if this doesn't get you pumped up,
I can't take credit for that.
Like, I feel like I'm, running into the wrestling ring. It's crazy.
All right, good stuff.
WWE. That was not a paid endorsement. All right, so let's
Perhaps
talk
in the future.
There you go. Let's talk about regulation. How do we regulate PFAs? What do we do, Tony? Where do we go from here?
There's a process that's been underway for a few years now. It's gone painfully slow for some folks. It's a process that really doesn't adapt well to situations like this. And there's probably every day, particularly in this part of the country, you're reading about how upset members of Congress are that the EPA, for example, as the lead environmental regulators, aren't doing enough to establish regulatory limits for this substance and how it should be done quicker. We talked earlier about how there's a monitoring program and a period of time that goes by to measure where this stuff is and what's a fair limit and what that number ultimately ought to be. And pretty much every day you're seeing members of Congress come together and say, we're going to change that law, that underlying law, to require EPA to move sooner on this. In the first instance, not to just decide whether or not a limit ought to be established, but to mandate that a limit ought to be established and to give EPA a deadline in order to do it. What's difficult about that, and not to defend industry and not to defend bureaucracy, but this is always, and it's pervasive in environmental law, is the study of something scientifically in order to really understand what it is and how we're interacting with it is something that just has to take place. Otherwise, you get into what we talked about earlier, kind of emotional reactions to substances that appear to be hazardous. And what is the popular response to something like that? Just what you would think it would be, that the crowds would get together and everybody says this stuff has to be banned and industry has to pay millions and billions in order to pay us back for having to deal with this, and then we'll be on to the next chemical 5 or 10 years from now, just like PFAs, that we thought at the time was beneficial, but that over a period of 10, 20 years, we're starting to realize is having an adverse human health impact. And you'll be back into that same cycle. And to be honest with you, industry is too creative, and credit to the American chemical industry that they are as creative as they are to come up with chemicals that are effective and affordable and that benefit our lives day to day, but could have impacts that even they couldn't have understood over time. And how it's a dance, it's a process that in some cases is just horribly slow, and that's a lot of what you're seeing in headlines these days about how EPA is not doing enough to bring industry to their knees to establish a limit for this and to do something about it. Some of that is a criticism of the fact that it's an EPA under the Trump administration where politically it's popular to attack the president and as being a friend of industry and not a man of the people. But by the same token, if you were to put all that aside, EPA still has a process they have to follow. They cannot arbitrarily come up with a number and impose it. Industry will challenge it. They'll be in court tomorrow, and it'll be wiped away, and we'll be starting all over again.
My quick political editorial will be, it is President Trump who wanted to do in with the EPA. So we're not going to defend him as to why he chooses industry over people, but we know that he's not a fan of the EPA. I want to go through a little bit of the evolution of regulation, because I think that it's important to highlight the fact that we don't know what we don't know. In 2009, the EPA issued provisional health advisory levels. And this is what they're doing, right? They're issuing advisory levels because they don't know.
Correct.
And they don't know how to create regulations and standards. So this is an advisory level. And at that time, for PFOAs, it was 400 parts per trillion. For PFOs, which we haven't talked about, and I don't want to get off on another path, it was 200 parts per trillion to protect against short-term exposures. In May of 2012, and we've talked about acronyms, UCMR, the Unregulated Contaminant Monitoring Rule, identified 6 PFAs for further evaluation. This is 2012. This is 7 years ago, and we really haven't gotten that far since then. In May of 2016, the EPA issued a new lifetime health advisory. When I hear lifetime health advisory, to me, that's, hey, buzzer, bell, whistle. This is important, right? Now we're talking about a health advisory for PFOA and PFOS in drinking water of 70 parts per trillion. It went from 400 to 70. Then in June of 2018, there's a draft for minimum risks, which are much lower than health advisory levels. And then in November of 2018, there's a draft of toxicity assessments. All of these things are well and good, but the fact remains, today we still don't have a standard. We still don't have a law or regulations on the book, right?
We don't, and that's part of the controversy these days. EPA earlier this year in February took credit for what they called an action plan for dealing with PFAS, PFOA, all the substances, and they called it an action plan. Here we are 10 years after the start of the process, that just the segment of the process that you talked about a minute ago. And what is EPA taking credit for? Well, they're going to move forward with establishing a limit, an MCL as it's known, for these chemicals in drinking water and in other sources. They're going to make PFOA and PFOS a hazardous substance as it's known under the law, so that if it's found in waste, it can be treated as a hazardous waste. Right now, it isn't. They're going to under toxic chemical laws, regulate whether or not these chemicals can be introduced into the marketplace at all, which is something that's still being worked on. They're going to engage in nationwide drinking water monitoring for the presence of these chemicals, where it's currently not the case. and take further action to study it and study it more. What's the public's reaction to that been, particularly in Congress? Action plan is nice. We want more. And when you ask the question of EPA, that's a nice action plan. When are you going to come up with a limit? And the answer is the standard bureaucratic response, which is probably 2 to 3 years from now. And that's a response that if you're a bureaucrat, and even a responsible bureaucrat in your own mind, you think, I'm doing my job, I see the law gives me this amount of time, I'm going to study something thoroughly so that when we come up with a limit, it's going to stick. It's not something that's going to be wiped away. Unfortunately, the way the process works, 2 to 3 years from now, is something that the public will never tolerate.
Part of the problem that we have is there's no clear path for resolving this issue. It's a complicated issue. It's a complicated issue involving litigation that standing, your ability to step in and bring a case requires very specific circumstances, which we could probably do 2 more full shows on. So we're not going to get into that today. We know that there's been litigation that has been successful involving a carpet manufacturer, a shoe manufacturer, dairies. We know that there's been state actions. We talked about at the outset of the show, New Jersey's action against the manufacturers. This is something that's going to continue to evolve. So before we wrap things up here, let's talk about this February 2019 EPA action plan. And I think that this is something that we really need to keep an eye on. And when we talk about the sanctity of independent agencies like the EPA, or agencies that should be independent like the EPA, it's important to understand that they need our support also as voters. That was my get out the vote push. So the EPA, in their action plan February 2019, commits to short-term and a long-term study. Who cares, right? I mean, we have short-term studies, we have long-term studies. The fact is we need to continue studying. But that, to me, is we talk about in legal opinions dicta, what's in between, the ruling and that's nothing. That means nothing to me. They'll propose MCLs. They'll attempt to list PFOA and PFOS as hazardous substances under CERCLA. They're going to do additional toxicity reviews. Really what we need is we need regulations, we need standards, and we need action. So that being said, we could have done a couple more segments, and maybe we will, but thank you, Tony.
Special thanks to our guest, Tony Drollas, an attorney with Malamut & Associates, Adam's guest for the full hour. This is the Adam Malamut Show on Talk Radio 1210, WPHT. Real people, real perspectives, real opinions. See you next time, everyone.
This program is a paid commercial announcement and in no way represents the views of WPHT or its management.